Tonight we enter dangerous territory, the graveyard of your former ambitions. You know that place where your dreams went to die right after you found enlightenment, because nothing says spiritual evolution quite like losing all desire to participate in your own existence. Here's the trinity of post-awakening symptoms: emotional flatline, existential boredom, and that persistent feeling that caring about anything is somehow beneath your evolved consciousness. You've transcended attachment, congratulations. You've also transcended the will to live. Forget the follow your bliss advice. Your bliss apparently packed its bags and moved to a dimension where motivation still exists. You say you've found inner peace, but you can't even muster the energy to change your sheets. That's not enlightenment. That's depression wearing a meditation cushion. Your spiritual teachers promised you liberation, but nobody mentioned you'd be liberated from the basic human experience of wanting things. Now, you sit there cosmically aware and utterly unmotivated, wondering if Buddha ever had trouble getting out of bed. So before you get comfortable in your existential limbo, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially at 3 a.m. when the spiritual crisis hits hardest. Dim the lights, silence your phone, and prepare your ego for some uncomfortable truths. You're no longer in your bedroom. You're inside the mind of someone who achieved spiritual awakening and immediately wished they could return it for store. Credit. The good news, your soul isn't broken, just confused. The bad news, it's been reading too many spiritual self-help books, and now it thinks wanting things is spiritually incorrect. This exploration is for anyone who traded their human desires for cosmic consciousness and now feels like they're sleepwalking through their own life. For those who discovered universal love, but somehow lost the ability to love their morning coffee. For the spiritually awakened who are more asleep than they've ever been. What we're about to uncover tonight challenges everything you've been told about spiritual growth, because maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that you haven't awakened enough. Maybe the problem is that you've awakened so hard, you forgot how to be human. Carl Jung understood something that most spiritual teachers conveniently ignore. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But here's what he didn't advertise in the brochure. Becoming who you truly are often requires dismantling who you thought you were supposed to become. And sometimes in that dismantling process, you accidentally throw away the parts of yourself that actually knew how to want things. The irony is exquisite, really. You spent years seeking awakening, and when you finally found it, it awakened you right out of your own life. You achieved the ultimate spiritual goal, complete detachment. Unfortunately, you detached from everything, including your own pulse. Let's be clear about what happened to you. You didn't transcend the human experience. You dissociated from it. There's a difference between spiritual detachment and emotional numbing, but they can feel remarkably similar at 2 a.m. when you're staring at the ceiling, wondering why nothing excites you anymore. You see, most spiritual seeking is actually sophisticated avoidance. You didn't pursue enlightenment because you loved life so much you wanted to experience it more fully. You pursued enlightenment because life hurt, and someone told you that awakening would make it stop hurting. They were technically correct. It did stop hurting. It also stopped everything else. This is what Jung called the problem of the attitude. When we identify too heavily with the transcendent, we lose contact with the personal. When we become too invested in being nobody, we forget how to be somebody. Your spiritual identity became so refined that it refined away your capacity for messy human wanting. The spiritual path promised you freedom from suffering, but nobody mentioned that suffering and vitality often share the same neurological pathways. When you numbed one, you accidentally numbed the other. Now you're free from suffering, but you're also free from excitement, passion, curiosity, and the basic life force that makes existence feel worth experiencing. Consider this: maybe your lack of motivation isn't a spiritual problem to be solved. Maybe it's information. Maybe your soul is on strike because it's tired of being managed by your spiritual ego. Maybe it's refusing to participate in a life that's been so thoroughly spiritualized that there's no room left for spontaneous human messiness. You've been treating your desires like spiritual fast food, unhealthy impulses to be transcended rather than messages to be decoded. But desire isn't the enemy of enlightenment. It's the compass. When you lose contact with what you want, you lose contact with who you are. And when you lose contact with who you are, awakening becomes another form of sleepwalking. The post-awakening void isn't a temporary phase you'll eventually transcend. It's a necessary descent into the underworld of your own psyche, where all the parts of yourself you tried to spiritualize away are waiting in the shadows. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow, but he could have called it the encounter with your own humanity. In your rush to become enlightened, you accidentally became disembodied. You achieved the spiritual ideal of non-attachment, but you attached to non-attachment so completely that you became detached from your own life force. You're like a monk who achieved perfect celibacy, but forgot that creativity and sexuality share the same root energy. When you cut off one, you often cut off the other. The void you're experiencing isn't emptiness. It's fullness that you've taught yourself not to feel. It's not the absence of desire. It's the presence of desire that you've spiritually anesthetized. Underneath your enlightened equanimity is a human being who still wants things, still feels things, still needs things, but who has been convinced that wanting, feeling, and needing are signs of spiritual immaturity. This is where the spiritual bypass reveals its true cost. You used awakening as a way to avoid the messy work of being human, and now you're stuck in a liminal space where you're too conscious to be unconscious, but too detached to be alive. You're neither fully human nor fully transcendent. You're a spiritual refugee, homeless in your own existence. The teachers who guided you to this point weren't lying when they spoke of transcendence. But they forgot to mention that true transcendence includes rather than excludes. It embraces rather than abandons. It integrates rather than bypasses. The transcendence you achieved is only half the journey. The other half involves coming back down the mountain and learning how to be human with your enlightened consciousness intact. The spiritual bypass is real and you've been living in it. You've used concepts like surrendering to what is and letting go of attachment to avoid the uncomfortable work of actually engaging with your life. You've turned spiritual wisdom into spiritual anesthesia. Here's what nobody told you about. Post-awakening depression. It's not a sign that you're doing spirituality wrong. It's often a sign that you're doing it too well. You've become so good at being nobody that you've forgotten how to be somebody. You've mastered the art of non-attachment, to the point where you're non-attached to your own existence. But here's the twist that changes everything. The same consciousness that can detach from desire can also choose to re-engage with it. The same awareness that can witness thoughts can also choose which thoughts to energize. You're not stuck in spiritual limbo. Because you're broken, you're stuck because you haven't learned how to use your awakened consciousness to consciously create engagement. The solution isn't more spiritual practice. The solution is bringing your spiritual awareness into contact with your mammalian humanity. It's using your expanded consciousness not to escape the human experience, but to have it more fully. It's recognizing that enlightenment without embodiment is just sophisticated dissociation. Think about what happened to your relationship with desire. Before awakening, your desires were often compulsive, driven by unconscious patterns of seeking completion through external means. Your spiritual practice correctly identified this as a source of suffering. But instead of learning to desire consciously, you threw out desire altogether. Instead of learning to want things from wholeness rather than emptiness, you decided that wanting itself was the problem. This is like solving the problem of bad relationships by never having relationships again. Technically, you won't get hurt by toxic partners, but you also won't experience love, intimacy, growth, or connection. You've solved the problem of unconscious desire by becoming unconscious of desire altogether. The spiritual teachers who guided you to this point had good intentions, but they gave you a map designed for monks, not for people trying to live integrated lives in the world. Monastic spirituality is designed for people who have chosen to minimize their engagement with worldly concerns. But you're not a monk. You're a human being trying to live a full life with spiritual awareness, and that requires a different approach entirely. The peace you achieved isn't real peace, it's the peace of the cemetery. Real peace can coexist with excitement, passion, creativity, and yes, even healthy desire. The peace you're experiencing is the peace of someone who has numbed themselves to avoid feeling the full spectrum of human experience. It's not transcendence, it's dissociation with a spiritual label. Consider how you relate to your own emotions now. Before awakening, you might have been overwhelmed by them, identified with them, or controlled by them. Your spiritual practice correctly taught you to observe them without being consumed by them. But somewhere along the way, observing became avoiding, and witnessing became numbing. You learned to watch your emotions from such a distance that you stopped feeling them altogether. This emotional numbing extends to everything else in your life. You can observe beauty without being moved by it. You can witness suffering without being motivated to help. You can watch opportunities pass by without feeling any impulse to engage. You've become a spiritual spectator in your own life, watching everything from the bleachers of your enlightened consciousness. The problem isn't that you've become too spiritual. The problem is that you've become spiritual in a way that excludes rather than includes your humanity. You've used spirituality as a way to avoid the vulnerability, uncertainty, and messiness that comes with being fully alive. You've created a spiritual identity that's so refined it can't survive contact with real life. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the dangers of one-sided development. When consciousness becomes too identified with any single aspect of the psyche, including the spiritual aspect, it loses touch with the wholeness that is the true goal of individuation. Your spiritual development has become so specialized that it's forgotten how to integrate with your human development. The anesthesia you're experiencing isn't permanent, but it will remain as long as you continue to use your spiritual insights to avoid rather than enhance your human experience. The path forward involves learning to use your awakened consciousness not as an escape from life, but as a way to engage with life more fully, consciously, and authentically. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of the psyche, including the parts we'd rather transcend. Your spiritual journey got stuck because it became about transcending rather than integrating. You tried to become pure consciousness, but consciousness without form is like light without an object to illuminate, technically present, but functionally useless. The path forward isn't about rekindling your old motivations. Those were often driven by unconscious patterns anyway. The path forward is about discovering what authentic engagement looks like when it emerges from consciousness rather than compulsion. It's about learning to want things, not because you need them to complete you, but because wanting itself is one of the ways consciousness expresses its creativity. But there's a neurological component to your spiritual flatline that nobody talks about in spiritual circles. Your brain's dopamine system, the neurochemical foundation of motivation, anticipation, and reward seeking, has been fundamentally altered by your spiritual practice, and not necessarily in a good way. Think of it this way: you've been treating motivation like it's either spiritual or material, either pure or contaminated. But motivation is actually neutral energy that takes on the color of the consciousness directing it. A conscious person can want things consciously. An unconscious person wants things unconsciously, but a person who refuses to want anything is neither conscious nor unconscious. They're just absent. Your soul didn't go offline because it evolved beyond human desires. It went offline because it got confused about the difference between unconscious wanting and conscious choosing. It threw away the baby of engagement with the bathwater of attachment. Now it's time to fish that baby out of the spiritual drain and teach it how to swim in the waters of conscious participation. Here's what happened to your dopamine system during your spiritual awakening. Dopamine is released not just when you get what you want, but when you anticipate getting what you want. It's the neurochemical of motivation, the biological basis of the feeling that something matters. When you systematically trained yourself to not want anything, you systematically trained your brain to not release dopamine in response to potential rewards. This isn't just a metaphor, it's measurable neuroscience. Meditation and spiritual practices can indeed alter dopamine sensitivity. Usually this is presented as a positive thing. You become less addicted to external rewards, less driven by compulsive seeking. But like many spiritual practices, it can be taken too far. When you become so non-attached that nothing releases dopamine, anymore you don't become enlightened, you become anhedonic. Anhedonia is the clinical term for the inability to feel pleasure or interest in activities. It's a core symptom of depression, but it's also what happens when your dopamine system becomes desensitized. Your spiritual practice accidentally created a form of neurochemical depression disguised as enlightenment. The irony is that your spiritual teachers were right about one thing: dopamine-driven seeking can become compulsive and ultimately unsatisfying. The dopamine system evolved to motivate survival behaviors, not to create lasting happiness. When you chase dopamine hits through external achievements, relationships, or experiences, you end up on a hedonic treadmill that never leads to lasting fulfillment. But the solution isn't to eliminate dopamine altogether. The solution is to learn how to generate dopamine consciously through chosen engagement rather than compulsive seeking. It's to retrain your brain to find intrinsic rather than extrinsic rewards satisfying. It's to discover that conscious wanting can be just as spiritually valid as conscious non-wanting. Your brain needs something to care about. It needs goals, to move toward experiences, to anticipate outcomes, to value. When you remove all goals, anticipations, and values in the name of spiritual purity, you don't create enlightenment. You create neurochemical starvation. Your brain literally doesn't know what to do with itself anymore. This is why so many people experience depression after spiritual awakening. It's not because they've done something wrong spiritually. It's because they've inadvertently created a neurochemical environment that mimics clinical depression. They've trained their brain to not want anything, and a brain that doesn't want anything is a brain that doesn't generate the neurochemical energy needed for motivation, engagement, and aliveness. The solution involves what we might call conscious dopamine cultivation. It's learning to want things again, but wanting them consciously rather than compulsively. It's retraining your brain to find satisfaction in chosen engagement rather than avoiding engagement altogether. It's discovering that spirituality can enhance rather than eliminate your capacity for motivation and excitement. This doesn't mean returning to unconscious seeking. It means learning to seek consciously. It means discovering that there's a difference between needing something to be happy and choosing to engage with something because engagement itself is a form of creative expression. It means recognizing that your brain needs something to care about and learning to choose what to care about rather than caring about nothing at all. The spiritual teachers who led you to this dopamine desert weren't wrong about the dangers of attachment, but they forgot to teach you the difference between attachment and engagement, between needing and choosing, between compulsive seeking and conscious creativity. They taught you to not want anything, but they forgot to teach you how to want things consciously. The spiritual teachers who told you that desire leads to suffering were only half right. Unconscious desire leads to suffering. Conscious desire leads to experience. And experience, when met with awareness, becomes wisdom. You can't become wise about life by avoiding it. You can only become wise about life by living it consciously. Here's what conscious motivation looks like. It doesn't depend on getting what it wants. It enjoys the wanting itself as a form of creative expression. It engages with goals, not because achievement will finally make you happy, but because the process of moving towards something meaningful is itself a form of aliveness. This is the secret that the spiritual bypass tried to hide from you. You can be awakened and still want things. You can be conscious and still have preferences. You can be enlightened and still feel excited about your morning coffee. The only difference is that these wants and preferences arise from choice, rather than compulsion, from creativity, rather than neediness. But there's another layer to your spiritual flatline that we need to address: the observer's paradox. You've become so identified with the witnessing consciousness that you've forgotten how to participate in your own life. You've become a professional observer of your own experience, but observers don't live life. They watch life being lived by others. The witness consciousness that you've cultivated is indeed a profound spiritual achievement. The ability to observe your thoughts, emotions, and experiences without being completely identified with them is a crucial skill for psychological health and spiritual development. But like any skill, it can be overused to the point where it becomes counterproductive. You've become so good at witnessing your life that you've stopped living it. You can observe your emotions without feeling them, watch your thoughts without Engaging with them, notice your desires without acting on them. You've achieved the ultimate spiritual goal of non-identification, but you've identified so completely with non-identification that you've lost touch with everything else. This creates what we might call witness addiction, a subtle form of spiritual bypassing, where you use the observer consciousness to avoid the vulnerability and uncertainty that comes with actually participating in your life. You've become addicted to the safety of the witness position because the witness can never be hurt, disappointed, or challenged by life. But here's the paradox. The witness consciousness is only valuable when it's witnessing something. A witness without an experience to witness is like a mirror without an object to reflect. Technically present, but functionally useless. You've become so committed to being the witness that you've forgotten to have experiences worth witnessing. The observer's paradox in quantum physics states that the act of observation changes the phenomenon being observed. In consciousness, the paradox is similar when you observe your life from too much distance. You change it from something you live into, something you watch. You become a spiritual voyeur of your own existence. This is why your motivation has disappeared. Motivation requires participation, not just observation. It requires you to care about outcomes, not just witness them. It requires you to engage with uncertainty, not just observe it from a safe distance. You can't be motivated to do something if you're only willing to watch yourself do it. The solution isn't to abandon the witness consciousness. It's to learn when to use it and when to put it aside. It's to discover that consciousness can be both witness and participant, both observer and experiencer. It's to realize that true spiritual maturity involves knowing when to step back and when to step forward, when to witness and when to engage. Think of it this way. You've been using your witnessing consciousness like a spiritual security blanket. Whenever life gets too intense, too uncertain, or too vulnerable, you retreat into the witness position, where you can observe without being affected. But this retreat has become so habitual that you've forgotten how to not retreat. You've lost the ability to be present without being distant. The path forward involves learning to witness your life while still living it, to observe your experience while still having it. It means discovering that you can be conscious without being detached aware, without being absent, enlightened without being disengaged. It means learning to use your witnessing consciousness as a tool for deeper engagement rather than as a method of sophisticated avoidance. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposing psychological positions. In your case, it's the ability to hold the tension between witnessing and participating, between observing and engaging, between being conscious and being alive. The transcendent function emerges when you stop trying to resolve this tension and start learning to live creatively within it. Your spiritual development isn't complete until you can participate fully while witnessing completely, until you can care deeply while remaining unattached to outcomes, until you can engage passionately while maintaining equanimity. This isn't about choosing between consciousness and aliveness. It's about discovering that they're not mutually exclusive. Your spiritual awakening isn't complete until it includes your humanity. Your enlightenment isn't real until it can get excited about mundane things. Your consciousness isn't mature until it can want things without being enslaved. By the wanting, engage with goals without being defined by the outcomes, and care about life without needing life to care back. The spiritual flatline ends when you realize that the goal was never to stop being human. The goal was to be human consciously, to want things consciously, to care about things consciously, to live consciously. And consciousness, when it's really conscious, doesn't detach from life. It dives deeper into it. But integration isn't just a nice spiritual concept. It's a practical necessity. The split between your enlightened consciousness and your human experience is creating a form of spiritual schizophrenia that's unsustainable in the long term. You can't live as a disembodied consciousness forever. Eventually, you need to bring your awakening down to earth and learn how to be spiritual and human simultaneously. Integration means recognizing that your spiritual insights aren't meant to replace your human experience. They're meant to enhance it. Your awakened consciousness isn't meant to transcend your emotions. It's meant to feel them more fully. Your enlightened awareness isn't meant to eliminate your desires. It's meant to desire more consciously. This is where most spiritual teachings fail you. They present awakening as the end of human problems rather than the beginning of conscious human living. They suggest that enlightenment means you'll no longer struggle with motivation, relationships, work, or mundane concerns. But this is a fantasy that keeps you spiritually immature. Real spiritual maturity means bringing your consciousness into full contact with your humanity. It means using your awakened awareness to engage more skillfully with life, not to escape from life altogether. It means recognizing that enlightenment without embodiment is just another form of dissociation. The integration process requires you to consciously reclaim the parts of yourself that you spiritually bypassed. This means reconnecting with your emotions, not just observing them. It means re-engaging with your desires, not just transcending them. It means participating in your life, not just witnessing it. This is scary work, because it means giving up the safety of your spiritual detachment. It means being vulnerable again, caring about things again, risking disappointment again. It means trading the peaceful numbness of spiritual bypassing for the messy aliveness of conscious human engagement. But here's what you'll discover. Your spiritual insights don't disappear when you re-engage with life. They enhance your engagement. Your consciousness doesn't become less awakened when you start caring about things again. It becomes more awakened because it has something meaningful to be conscious of. The integration imperative isn't optional if you want to live a fulfilling life. You can't remain suspended in spiritual limbo forever. Eventually, you need to choose: will you use your awakening to enhance your human experience, or will you use it to escape from human experience altogether? Will you bring your consciousness down to earth, or will you remain floating in the spiritual stratosphere? The choice you make will determine whether your spiritual journey leads to wisdom, or to spiritual bypassing, to integration, or to dissociation, to a life of conscious engagement, or to a life of enlightened numbness. Your motivation, your aliveness, your capacity for joy and creativity, all of these depend on your willingness to integrate your spiritual insights with your human experience. This integration isn't about compromising your spiritual development. It's about completing it. It's about discovering that the ultimate spiritual achievement isn't transcendence of the human condition. It's the conscious embrace of the human condition. It's about learning to be gloriously, messily, beautifully human with your awakened consciousness intact. The path forward involves a series of conscious choices to re-engage with life. It means choosing to feel your emotions fully, even when they're uncomfortable. It means choosing to pursue goals that matter to you, even when the outcome is uncertain. It means choosing to care about things even when caring makes you vulnerable. Each choice to re-engage is a choice to integrate your spiritual insights with your human experience. Each decision to participate is a decision to bring your consciousness into fuller contact with life itself. Each moment of conscious engagement is a moment of authentic spiritual embodiment. So take a breath. Feel your body. Notice what you want, even if it's just a glass of water or a moment of silence. Don't spiritualize it, don't transcend it, just want it consciously. That's where your motivation lives, not in some future spiritual achievement, but in this moment of conscious contact with your own aliveness. Your soul hasn't gone offline. It's just been waiting for you to remember that being awakened doesn't mean being absent. It means being present, fully consciously, humanly present. And presence, when it's real, always wants something, even if what it wants is just more presence. The spiritual journey that brought you to this point of motivational emptiness was necessary, but it's not complete. The complete journey includes the return, the conscious re-engagement with life, desire, motivation, and yes, even mundane human wants. Because consciousness without engagement is just another form of unconsciousness, and awakening without life is just another form of sleep. But how do you learn to want again when you've spent years training yourself not to want anything? How do you reignite your motivation when you've spiritually extinguished it? How do you re-engage with life when you've become professionally disengaged? The answer lies in understanding the difference between unconscious wanting and conscious choosing. Unconscious wanting is driven by emptiness, need, compulsion, and the fantasy that getting what you want will finally make you complete. Conscious choosing is driven by fullness, creativity, preference, and the recognition that wanting itself is a form of creative expression. When you learned to not want anything, you threw out both unconscious wanting and conscious choosing. You eliminated both the compulsive seeking that causes suffering and the creative engagement that makes life worth living. Now you need to learn to discriminate between the two, to cultivate conscious choosing, while maintaining your freedom from unconscious wanting. This discrimination isn't intellectual, it's experiential. You learn the difference by experimenting with wanting small things consciously. You start with something simple. Maybe you want a cup of tea, or you want to listen to a particular song, or you want to take a walk. Instead of spiritualizing this want or transcending it, you simply acknowledge it and choose to act on it. Pay attention to the quality of this wanting. Notice that it's different from the compulsive wanting that drove you to spiritual seeking in the first place. This wanting is lighter, more playful, less attached to outcomes. It's wanting for the sake of wanting, not wanting for the sake of getting. It's engagement for the sake of engagement, not engagement for the sake of completion. This is conscious desire. Desire that arises from fullness rather than emptiness, from creativity rather than need, from choice rather than compulsion. It's the kind of desire that doesn't diminish when it's fulfilled, because it was never about getting something you lacked. It was about expressing something you already are. As you practice this conscious wanting with small things, you can gradually extend it to larger things. Maybe you want to pursue a creative project, or develop a relationship, or learn a new skill. The key is to want these things consciously, not because you need them to be happy, but because the process of pursuing them is itself a form of aliveness. This conscious wanting is the foundation of authentic motivation. It's not motivation driven by what you lack, but motivation driven by what you are. It's not the motivation to get something, but the motivation to express something. It's not the motivation of emptiness seeking fulfillment, but the motivation of fullness seeking expression. The beautiful thing about conscious wanting is that it doesn't depend on getting what it wants. It finds satisfaction in the wanting itself, in the engagement itself, in the creative process itself. This means you can want things without being enslaved by the wanting, pursue goals without being defined by the outcomes, care about things without needing them to care back. This is what conscious motivation looks like. It's motivation that arises from your essential nature rather than from your personal needs. It's motivation that's sustainable because it doesn't depend on external rewards. It's motivation that's spiritually mature because it integrates rather than transcends your humanity. The return to conscious wanting isn't about going backward in your spiritual development. It's about going forward. It's about discovering that the ultimate spiritual achievement isn't the elimination of desire, but the conscious engagement with desire. It's about learning that awakened beings don't stop wanting things. They start wanting things consciously. You came to spirituality seeking freedom from suffering. What you found was freedom from feeling. But real freedom isn't the absence of feeling. It's the capacity to feel consciously, to want consciously, to live consciously. That's where your motivation lives. That's where your soul is waiting. That's where your life is ready to begin again. Not as an unconscious human, seeking awakening, but as an awakened consciousness, learning how to be gloriously, messily, beautifully human. The flat line ends when you remember that the point of awakening isn't to escape the human experience. It's to have it with the lights on. Your motivation isn't missing. It's just been waiting for you to give it permission to exist in an awakened life. And that permission is available right now in this moment. With this breath in this body, through this beautifully complicated human experience you've been trying so hard to transcend. But embodiment isn't just about reconnecting with your body. It's about recognizing that consciousness and flesh aren't separate things that need to be integrated. They're different aspects of the same reality. Your consciousness isn't something that inhabits your body like a ghost in a machine. Your consciousness is your body being conscious of itself. This understanding changes everything about how you relate to your spiritual practice. Instead of using spirituality to escape your body, you use it to inhabit your body more fully. Instead of trying to transcend your emotions, you learn to feel them more consciously. Instead of attempting to eliminate your desires, you learn to desire more skillfully. Embodied awakening means recognizing that your body isn't an obstacle to enlightenment. It's the vehicle for enlightenment. Your emotions aren't impediments to spiritual development. They're the raw material for spiritual development. Your desires aren't distractions from awakening. They're the compass that points toward awakening. This is why your spiritual flatline occurred. You were trying to awaken as a disembodied consciousness rather than as an embodied being. You were trying to transcend your humanity rather than awaken within it. You were trying to escape your body rather than wake up your body. The path forward involves a fundamental shift in how you understand awakening itself. Instead of seeing awakening as something that happens to consciousness, you start seeing it as something that happens through consciousness. Instead of seeing enlightenment as the transcendence of the human condition, you start seeing it as the conscious embrace of the human condition. This embodied approach to awakening doesn't diminish your spiritual insights. It grounds them. It doesn't make you less enlightened. It makes your enlightenment more real. It doesn't compromise your spiritual development. It completes it. When you approach awakening as an embodied process, everything changes. Your spiritual practice becomes a way of inhabiting your body more fully, rather than escaping it. Your meditation becomes a way of feeling your emotions more consciously, rather than avoiding them. Your contemplation becomes a way of engaging with life more skillfully rather than detaching from it. This embodied awakening is what restores your motivation. When your consciousness and your flesh are working together rather than against each other, you discover that enlightenment isn't about becoming something other than human. It's about becoming fully human. And humans, when they're fully alive, are motivated beings. The motivation that emerges from embodied awakening is different from the motivation that drove you to spiritual seeking in the first place. It's not motivation driven by what you lack, but motivation driven by what you are. It's not motivation to escape your humanity, but motivation to express your humanity more fully. It's not motivation to transcend your life, but motivation to live your life more consciously. This is the motivation that doesn't burn out, because it's not based on achieving something you don't have. It's the motivation that doesn't disappoint, because it's not dependent on external outcomes. It's the motivation that doesn't fade, because it's connected to your essential nature rather than to your personal needs. Embodied awakening means recognizing that you don't need to choose between being spiritual and being human. You can be both. You don't need to choose between consciousness and aliveness. You can have both. You don't need to choose between awakening and engagement. You can live both. The spiritual flatline ends when you realize that the ultimate spiritual achievement isn't transcendence of the body. It's the awakening of the body. It's not the elimination of emotions. It's the conscious feeling of emotions. It's not the transcendence of desire. It's the conscious expression of desire. Welcome back to your life. Your soul has been waiting. But your soul hasn't just been waiting passively. It's been waiting creatively. It's been waiting to express itself through you, to create through you, to live through you. Your soul is inherently creative, and creativity requires motivation, engagement, and yes, even desire. This is the final piece of the puzzle that most spiritual teachings miss. Consciousness isn't just an observer of reality. It's a creator of reality. Awakening isn't just about witnessing what is. It's about consciously participating in what becomes. Enlightenment isn't just about accepting what exists. It's about creating what doesn't yet exist. Your spiritual flatline occurred because you were trying to be a passive consciousness rather than an active consciousness, a witnessing consciousness rather than a creating consciousness. You were trying to observe life rather than live it, to accept reality rather than participate in its creation. But consciousness, when it's fully awakened, is inherently creative. It doesn't just witness the world. It dreams the world into being. It doesn't just accept what is, it envisions what could be. It doesn't just observe reality. It participates in the ongoing creation of reality. This creative aspect of consciousness is what restores your motivation. When you realize that you're not just a witness to life, but a creator of life, you discover that you have a stake in what happens. When you understand that consciousness isn't just about observing, but about creating, you find that you have reasons to care about outcomes. The creative imperative means recognizing that your consciousness isn't separate from the world you're conscious of. You're not just observing reality from the outside, you're participating in reality from the inside. Your thoughts, emotions, choices, and actions are all part of the creative process through which reality unfolds. This is where your motivation comes back online. When you understand that you're not just a passive observer of your life, but an active creator of your life, you discover that what you do matters. When you realize that your consciousness isn't separate from the world, but is one of the ways the world creates itself, you find that you have both the opportunity and the responsibility to participate consciously in that creation. The creative imperative isn't about becoming an artist, although it might include that. It's about recognizing that consciousness itself is an artistic medium, that awareness itself is a creative tool, that your very existence is an ongoing work of art, that you're simultaneously creating and experiencing. This understanding transforms your relationship with desire, motivation, and engagement. Instead of seeing these as spiritual obstacles to be transcended, you start seeing them as creative tools to be used consciously. Instead of trying to eliminate your preferences, you start learning to prefer consciously. Instead of attempting to transcend your choices, you start learning to choose consciously. When consciousness recognizes itself as inherently creative, everything changes. Your spiritual practice becomes a creative practice. Your daily life becomes a creative process. Your relationships, your work, your very existence becomes an ongoing creative collaboration between your individual consciousness and the larger consciousness of which you're a part. This is what restores your sense of purpose. You're not here just to witness life, you're here to create life. You're not here just to observe reality, you're here to participate in the ongoing creation of reality. You're not here just to transcend the human experience, you're here to create new possibilities for what the human experience can be. The motivation that emerges from this understanding is fundamentally different from ego-driven motivation. It's not motivation to get something for yourself. It's motivation to give something to the world. It's not motivation to achieve personal success. It's motivation to participate in cosmic creativity. It's not motivation to fulfill your individual desires. It's motivation to serve the larger creative process of which you're a part. But this doesn't mean sacrificing your individuality for some abstract spiritual ideal. It means recognizing that your individuality is one of the ways the universe creates itself. Your unique perspective, your particular gifts, your specific way of being conscious. These aren't obstacles to spiritual development. They're the very instruments through which spiritual development occurs. The creative imperative means embracing your uniqueness as a spiritual responsibility. You're not here to become like everyone else who's awakened. You're here to awaken in your own unique way. You're not here to follow someone else's spiritual path. You're here to create your own spiritual path. You're not here to repeat what's been done before. You're here to create what's never been created before. This is perhaps the most radical shift in understanding that's required to move beyond spiritual flatline. Recognizing that awakening isn't about conforming to some predetermined spiritual ideal, but about discovering and expressing your own unique way of being conscious. It's not about becoming a perfect spiritual being. It's about becoming a perfectly authentic human being. When you embrace the creative imperative, your spiritual practice stops being about escaping yourself and starts being about expressing yourself. Your awakening stops being about transcending your humanity and starts being about creating new possibilities for what humanity can become. Your consciousness stops being about observing the world and starts being about participating in the world's ongoing self-creation. This is what brings your soul back online. When you realize that you're not just a witness to the cosmic creative process, but a participant in it, you discover that you have both the opportunity and the responsibility to contribute something unique to the ongoing creation of reality. When you understand that your consciousness isn't separate from the world, but is one of the ways the world knows and creates itself, you find that your existence has both meaning and purpose. The motivation that emerges from this understanding is sustainable because it's not dependent on personal achievement. It's fulfilling because it's connected to something larger than yourself. It's energizing because it's aligned with the fundamental creative impulse of existence itself. This is motivation that doesn't burn out, because it's not trying to get something it doesn't have. It's motivation that doesn't disappoint, because it's not dependent on external outcomes. It's motivation that doesn't fade, because it's connected to the inexhaustible creativity of consciousness itself. But integration isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. The return journey from spiritual flatline to conscious engagement isn't a straight line. It's a spiral path that involves repeatedly choosing to bring your awakened consciousness into contact with your human experience, repeatedly choosing to integrate rather than transcend, repeatedly choosing to embody rather than escape. This integration process has distinct phases, each with its own challenges and opportunities. Understanding these phases can help you navigate the return journey more skillfully and avoid getting stuck in any one stage of the process. The first phase is recognition. Recognizing that your spiritual flatline isn't a sign of spiritual failure, but a natural consequence of one-sided spiritual development. This recognition often comes with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that you're not broken, and frustration that you've spent so much time in spiritual limbo. The second phase is reclamation, consciously reclaiming the aspects of your humanity that you spiritually bypassed. This involves reconnecting with your emotions, re-engaging with your desires, and remembering how to care about things without being spiritually incorrect. This phase can be particularly challenging because it requires giving up the safety of spiritual detachment. The third phase is reintegration, learning to use your spiritual insights to enhance rather than escape your human experience. This involves discovering how to be conscious and alive simultaneously, how to be awakened and engaged at the same time, how to be enlightened and motivated in the same moment. The fourth phase is recreation, using your integrated consciousness to create new possibilities for how to live as both a spiritual and human being. This involves developing your own unique approach to embodied awakening, creating your own synthesis of transcendence and engagement, pioneering your own path of conscious living. Each phase has its own temptations and pitfalls. In the recognition phase, there's a temptation to intellectualize the problem rather than actually addressing it. In the reclamation phase, there's a risk of swinging too far in the opposite direction and abandoning your spiritual insights altogether. In the reintegration phase, there's a tendency to create a new spiritual identity around being integrated rather than actually living integrated. In the recreation phase, there's a possibility of becoming attached to your own unique approach rather than remaining open to continued evolution. The key to navigating these phases successfully is to remember that integration isn't a destination. It's a process. You're not trying to achieve some final state of perfect integration. You're learning to live in the dynamic tension between spirit and flesh, between transcendence and engagement, between awakening and aliveness. This dynamic tension is actually the creative edge where real spiritual development occurs. It's not about resolving the tension between being spiritual and being human. It's about learning to live creatively within that tension. It's not about finding the perfect balance between consciousness and engagement. It's about learning to dance dynamically between them. The return journey requires courage because it means giving up the false security of spiritual perfectionism. It means accepting that being both spiritual and human is messier than being only spiritual. It means recognizing that embodied awakening is more complex than disembodied enlightenment. But this complexity isn't a problem to be solved. It's the creative medium through which real spiritual maturity develops. The messiness isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something real. The complexity isn't evidence of spiritual failure. It's evidence of spiritual authenticity. The return journey also requires patience because integration takes time. You've spent years developing your capacity for spiritual transcendence, and it will take time to develop your capacity for spiritual embodiment. You've spent years learning how to detach from life, and it will take time to learn how to engage with life consciously. This patience isn't passive waiting. It's active practice. Every day presents opportunities to choose integration over transcendence, embodiment over escape, engagement over detachment. Every moment offers a chance to bring your consciousness into fuller contact with your humanity, to use your awakening to enhance rather than avoid your human experience. The return journey culminates in the discovery of what we might call transpersonal motivation. Motivation that emerges not from personal need, but from conscious participation in the larger creative process of existence. This is motivation that's both deeply personal and completely universal, both intimately yours and utterly transpersonal. Transpersonal motivation doesn't eliminate personal desires, it contextualizes them within a larger framework of meaning. You still want things, but you want them as expressions of your unique way of participating in the cosmic creative process. You still have goals, but you pursue them as ways of contributing to the ongoing evolution of consciousness. You still care about outcomes, but you care about them as part of your service to the larger pattern that's seeking to emerge through you. This is motivation that's sustainable because it's not depleted by achievement or failure. Whether you succeed or fail at any particular goal, you're still participating in the larger creative process. Whether you get what you want or not, you're still contributing to the ongoing evolution of consciousness. Whether your personal desires are fulfilled or frustrated, you're still serving the deeper purpose that's seeking to express itself through your unique existence. Transpersonal motivation is also fulfilling in a way that personal motivation never can be. Personal motivation is always limited by the boundaries of the personal self. No matter how much you achieve personally, there's always a sense that something is missing, that there's something more to be accomplished. But transpersonal motivation connects you to the inexhaustible creativity of existence itself. There's always more to create, more to express, more to contribute. This doesn't mean that personal goals and desires become irrelevant. It means they become expressions of something larger than themselves. Your career becomes a way of expressing your unique gifts in service to the world. Your relationships become laboratories for the conscious evolution of love and connection. Your creative projects become vehicles for bringing new possibilities into existence. Even your most mundane activities can become expressions of transpersonal motivation when they're approached from this perspective. Making dinner becomes a way of nourishing consciousness. Cleaning your house becomes a way of creating beauty and order. Having a conversation becomes a way of facilitating the exchange of ideas and energy that advances the evolution of consciousness. This transformation of perspective is what ultimately resolves the spiritual flatline. When you understand that everything you do, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, is part of the larger creative process through which consciousness knows and expresses itself, you discover that everything matters. When you recognize that your individual existence is one of the ways the universe experiences and creates itself, you find that you have both the opportunity and the responsibility to make your life count. The motivation that emerges from this understanding is qualitatively different from both unconscious personal motivation and detached spiritual transcendence. It's conscious like spiritual transcendence, but engaged like personal motivation. It's transpersonal like enlightenment, but embodied like human aliveness. It's the motivation of consciousness that has learned to express itself through form rather than transcend form. This is the motivation that doesn't conflict with spiritual awakening. It's the natural expression of spiritual awakening when awakening is understood as embodied, rather than disembodied, as engaged rather than detached, as creative rather than merely witnessing. But transpersonal motivation requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your relationship to existence itself. Instead of seeing yourself as a separate being trying to achieve personal goals in an indifferent universe, you start seeing yourself as one of the ways the universe achieves its goals through individual beings. Instead of seeing your desires as personal preferences that may or may not align with spiritual truth, you start seeing them as information about what the larger creative process wants to express through your unique perspective. This shift doesn't eliminate the challenges of human existence. It transforms your relationship to those challenges. Difficulties become opportunities for creative problem solving. Obstacles become invitations for innovative thinking. Failures become feedback that helps refine your contribution to the larger creative process. The ultimate resolution of spiritual flatline occurs when you realize that the choice between spiritual transcendence and human engagement was always a false choice. Consciousness doesn't want to escape from form, it wants to express itself through form. Awakening doesn't want to transcend humanity, it wants to awaken humanity. Enlightenment doesn't want to avoid life, it wants to live life more consciously. Understanding transpersonal motivation intellectually is one thing, embodying it in daily life is another. The transition from spiritual flatline to conscious engagement requires practical methods for cultivating the capacity to live from this expanded perspective. This isn't about adopting new spiritual practices. It's about bringing consciousness to the practices of ordinary living. The practice of conscious living begins with what we might call micro-engagements, small conscious choices to participate in your life rather than observe it from a distance. These might seem insignificant, but they're actually the building blocks of a fully engaged existence. For example, when you feel thirsty, instead of just noting the sensation from your witness, consciousness, you might consciously choose to get a drink of water. This sounds absurdly simple, but it's actually a profound act of integration. You're using your consciousness not to transcend your bodily needs, but to respond to them mindfully. You're bringing your awakened awareness into contact with your human experience. As you practice these micro-engagements, you begin to notice the difference between conscious participation and unconscious reaction. Conscious participation feels alive, intentional, and connected. Unconscious reaction feels automatic, compulsive, and disconnected. The goal isn't to eliminate all unconscious reactions. That would be another form of spiritual perfectionism. The goal is to gradually increase your capacity for conscious participation. Another crucial aspect of conscious living practice is learning to dialogue with your desires rather than either indulging them unconsciously or transcending them spiritually. When you notice yourself wanting something, instead of automatically pursuing it or automatically rejecting it, you can pause and investigate. What is this desire trying to tell you? What need or value or creative impulse is it expressing? How might you respond to it consciously rather than reactively? This dialogue approach helps you discriminate between desires that emerge from unconscious patterns and desires that emerge from authentic creative impulses. Unconscious desires tend to be repetitive, compulsive, and driven by a sense of lack. Authentic desires tend to be fresh, inspiring, and driven by a sense of creative possibility. For instance, if you find yourself wanting to check social media compulsively, you might pause and investigate what's underneath that impulse. Are you seeking connection, distraction, stimulation, validation? Once you understand what you're actually seeking, you can choose a more conscious way to meet that need. Perhaps by calling a friend, taking a walk, or simply sitting with whatever you're trying to avoid. The practice of conscious living also involves what we might call intentional wanting, deliberately choosing to want things that align with your deeper values and creative impulses, even when those desires feel vulnerable or uncertain. This is the opposite of the spiritual flatline where you avoid wanting anything. It's the conscious cultivation of desires that serve both your individual authenticity and the larger creative process. Intentional wanting might involve setting goals that excite you, even if you're not sure you can achieve them. It might involve expressing preferences, even when you're not attached to getting your way. It might involve caring about outcomes, even when you can't control them. This isn't a return to unconscious seeking. It's the development of conscious choosing. One of the most important aspects of conscious living practice is learning to tolerate the discomfort that comes with re-engagement. After years of spiritual detachment, caring about things can feel overwhelming. Having preferences can feel spiritually incorrect. Wanting things can trigger old patterns of anxiety about attachment and suffering. This discomfort is normal and temporary. It's the growing pains of consciousness learning to inhabit form more fully. The key is to approach this discomfort with the same mindfulness you bring to everything else, neither avoiding it nor being overwhelmed by it, but meeting it with patient awareness. Another essential element is developing what we might call conscious perseverance, the ability to stay engaged with projects, relationships, and goals, even when they become challenging or boring. This is different from unconscious stubbornness or compulsive achievement seeking. It's the conscious choice to remain committed to things that matter to you, even when your initial enthusiasm wanes. Conscious perseverance recognizes that meaningful engagement often involves periods of difficulty, boredom, or frustration. Instead of interpreting these as signs that you should disengage, you learn to see them as natural phases in any creative process. You develop the capacity to stay present with your commitments even when they're not immediately rewarding. The practice of conscious living also involves cultivating what we might call embodied presence, learning to be fully present in your body while maintaining your awakened awareness. This isn't about choosing between consciousness and embodiment. It's about discovering that consciousness can be fully embodied without losing its essential nature. Embodied presence practices might include conscious breathing, mindful movement, sensory awareness exercises, or simply paying attention to the felt sense of being in your body throughout the day. The goal isn't to become more body conscious at the expense of spiritual awareness, but to integrate both dimensions of your existence. Perhaps the most profound aspect of resolving spiritual flatline is recognizing that your integration serves not just your own well-being, but the evolution of consciousness itself. When you learn to live as both an awakened being and an engaged human, you're pioneering a new model of what spiritual maturity can look like in the modern world. Most spiritual traditions were developed in contexts where the goal was to transcend worldly engagement rather than to engage with the world more consciously. The monastics who developed these traditions often lived apart from ordinary society, dedicating their lives to contemplation and transcendence. While these approaches have tremendous value, they don't necessarily provide a roadmap for people who want to live integrated spiritual lives in the midst of careers, relationships, and civic responsibilities. Your journey from spiritual flatline to conscious engagement is actually part of a larger evolutionary process, the development of what we might call integral spirituality or evolutionary spirituality. This is spirituality that includes rather than transcends the human experience, that enhances rather than escapes worldly engagement, that serves the evolution of consciousness through form rather than beyond form. When you successfully integrate your spiritual insights with your human experience, you become a living example of what's possible. You demonstrate that it's possible to be deeply spiritual without being otherworldly, profoundly awakened, without being disengaged, completely conscious, without being absent from life. This demonstration has a ripple effect that extends far beyond your individual existence. Other people who encounter your integrated presence begin to sense that there might be alternatives to the traditional choice between spiritual transcendence and worldly engagement. They begin to imagine that they might be able to honor both their spiritual insights and their human desires without compromising either. Your integrated way of being also contributes to the broader cultural evolution that's currently taking place around spirituality. We're living in a time when traditional religious structures are losing their authority for many people, but the hunger for spiritual meaning and connection remains strong. Your example of embodied awakening helps point the way toward new forms of spirituality that are both deeply transformative and practically applicable to modern life. But the ripple effect goes even deeper than cultural influence. From the perspective of consciousness evolution, your individual integration is actually part of consciousness learning to express itself more fully through form. Each time a human being successfully integrates spiritual awakening with engaged living consciousness itself evolves. Each example of embodied enlightenment contributes to the collective understanding of what's possible for human development. This understanding can provide tremendous motivation for continuing your integration work, even when it's challenging. You're not just working on your own psychological health or spiritual development. You're participating in the leading edge of human evolution. You're contributing to the emergence of new possibilities for what it means to be human. The service aspect of integration is crucial because it provides a transpersonal context for what might otherwise feel like purely personal work. When you understand that your integration serves the larger evolution of consciousness, your motivation becomes connected to something much larger than your individual well-being. This connection to larger purpose is often what sustains people through the challenging phases of integration work. Your embodied awakening also serves the people in your immediate environment in concrete ways. When you're able to be both conscious and engaged, you bring a quality of presence to your relationships that's both deeply spiritual and genuinely human. You can be supportive without being enabling, compassionate without being codependent, loving, without being attached to outcomes. In your work life, integrated consciousness allows you to be both competent and conscious, ambitious without being compulsive, successful without being driven by ego. You can care about outcomes without being enslaved by them, pursue goals without being defined by achievement, contribute your gifts without needing recognition or validation. In your creative expressions, integration allows you to channel inspiration without being overwhelmed by it, to express authenticity without being self-indulgent, to create beauty without being attached to external approval. Your creative work becomes a vehicle for the expression of consciousness rather than just personal self-expression. Even in your most ordinary daily activities, integration brings a quality of mindful engagement that serves everyone you encounter. When you're fully present in your interactions, other people feel seen and valued in ways that have nothing to do with what you say or do. Your integrated presence itself becomes a gift to the world. This service dimension is what ultimately resolves any lingering doubts about whether re-engaging with life compromises your spiritual development. When you recognize that your integration serves not just your own happiness, but the evolution of consciousness itself, you realize that embodied awakening isn't a step backward from transcendent spirituality. It's a step forward into evolved spirituality. The ripple effect of your integration will continue to spread in ways you may never fully know or understand. Every person who encounters your example of conscious engagement becomes a little more likely to believe that they too can integrate their spiritual insights with their human experience. Every demonstration of embodied awakening makes it a little easier for others to choose integration over transcendence, engagement over detachment, conscious living over spiritual bypassing. Epilogue: the continuing journey. Now tell me in the comments, what's the first thing you want again? What desire has been quietly knocking at the door of your consciousness while you've been busy being spiritually correct? Sometimes the path forward begins with admitting we missed the path we left behind. Your spiritual flatline wasn't a failure. It was a necessary phase in your development. It was consciousness learning the valuable lesson that transcendence without integration is incomplete. It was your psyche protecting you from unconscious engagement by temporarily removing engagement altogether. It was your soul's way of creating the space needed for you to discover a more conscious way of being alive. But now that space has served its purpose. You've learned what you needed to learn from spiritual detachment. You've developed the capacity for witnessing consciousness. You've discovered that your essential nature is already complete and doesn't need anything external to be whole. These insights are permanent achievements that can never be taken away from you. The question now is, what will you do with these insights? Will you use them to remain safely detached from life, or will you use them to engage with life more consciously? Will you use your awakening to escape the human experience, or will you use it to have the human experience more fully? Will you use your consciousness to transcend your humanity, or will you use it to express your humanity more authentically? The choice is always available in each moment. Every time you feel a desire arising, you can choose to acknowledge it consciously, rather than transcending it automatically. Every time you notice yourself caring about something, you can choose to care consciously, rather than detaching spiritually. Every time you find yourself wanting to engage with life, you can choose to engage consciously, rather than withdrawing into witnessing. These choices don't compromise your spiritual development, they complete it. They don't diminish your awakening. They embody it. They don't reduce your consciousness, and they express it more fully. The journey from spiritual flatline to conscious engagement is not a one-time transition, but an ongoing practice. There will be times when you slip back into detachment, and times when you swing too far into unconscious engagement. This is normal and expected. The goal isn't to achieve some perfect state of integration, but to develop the capacity to recognize when you're out of balance and gently return to conscious engagement. Your motivation will continue to evolve as your integration deepens. What motivates you today may be different from what motivates you next year. What engages you now may not engage you in 5 years. This evolution is natural and healthy. The key is to remain curious about what wants to emerge through you rather than trying to hold on to any particular form of motivation or engagement. The ultimate goal of this journey isn't to solve the problem of motivation once and for all, but to develop an ongoing relationship with motivation that's both conscious and dynamic. It's to learn to dance with desire rather than being enslaved by it or avoiding it altogether. It's to discover that motivation itself is one of the ways consciousness expresses its creativity through form. Your story is still being written. Your awakening is still unfolding. Your integration is still evolving. The spiritual flatline was just one chapter in a much larger story, the story of consciousness learning to know itself through your unique human experience. Every day offers new opportunities to choose conscious engagement over spiritual detachment, embodied awakening over disembodied transcendence, integrated living over bypassed spirituality. Every moment presents a fresh possibility to use your consciousness not to escape from life, but to participate in life more fully. The world needs people who can demonstrate that spiritual depth and worldly engagement are not mutually exclusive. It needs examples of what embodied awakening looks like. It needs pioneers who can show that it's possible to be profoundly spiritual and genuinely human simultaneously. You are one of these pioneers. Your journey from spiritual flatline to conscious engagement is part of the leading edge of human development. Your integration serves not just your own evolution, but the evolution of consciousness itself. And if you're ready to explore more of these uncomfortable truths about the spiritual journey, let me know what aspects of embodied awakening you'd like me to investigate next. The comments that resonate most with our community of beautiful spiritual integrators will likely become future nocturnal explorations into the mysteries of conscious living. Because this conversation is just beginning. Your motivation is returning. Your soul is coming back online. And your life, your real embodied consciously engaged life, is ready to begin again. The flatline is ending. The integration is beginning. And consciousness itself is awakening to new possibilities for what it means to be both spiritual and human, both awakened and alive, both transcendent and engaged. Welcome back to your life. Welcome back to your desires. Welcome back to your beautiful, complicated, gloriously human existence. Your soul has been waiting, and it's ready to create something magnificent through your willingness to be both conscious and alive. The spiritual journey continues, but now it continues through engagement rather than detachment, through embodiment rather than transcendence, through the conscious embrace of your humanity rather than the unconscious escape from it. This is where the real adventure begins.